Let's keep moving through Unit 4, Outcome 1. And in this video, we're going to look at this second key knowledge dot point here. So we're going to be looking at these observable characteristics that we can use to assess the health of any outdoor environment. If we look at past exam questions here, we can see that it's a really common feature on exams, and you have lots of opportunities to go back and practice there. If we just have a look here at the key knowledge first, it's observable characteristics to assess the health of outdoor environments. So we're looking at the quality of water, air, and soil, and then we're looking at species and ecosystem biodiversity. So because these are listed in the study design, you could essentially get a question that asks you specifically about one of those. So I guess the one to just be mindful of there is around the biodiversity stuff. And can you write about ecosystem biodiversity? I think species biodiversity is everyone's like initial starting point when we're looking at biodiversity, but I think ecosystem biodiversity can be a little bit more challenging for people, generally speaking. So just make sure you can write about that. The key skills to this, we actually see that the key skills is kind of interesting here. We need to evaluate the health of outdoor environments. So this has been a really common theme, but now we have this new aspect within our study design, and it's about create possible solutions to improve the environmental health. And this sits within Unit 4, Outcome 1. I guess for our exam, we don't need to worry because we're going to look at land management strategies in Outcome 2, but I guess that means that for the exam, they could ask questions around evaluate the health of an environment and what are some solutions to improve that health, or what are some land management strategies, some individual actions, community actions, Indigenous land management strategies that could be used to improve the health of an environment. But yeah, I think just seeing the link between this, like evaluating and assessing the health of an environment, and then maybe the implications around like, okay, once you've done that, how does that inform solutions to improve environmental health as well? Okay, revision question. When a question asks us to evaluate, what do we need to do? I'm going to give you some options here. Have a read of those. Pause the video if you need. And the correct answer is D. And it's because it looks similar to A, but hopefully you're picking up now that the difference between A and D is that in D there is a value-adding overall judgment call. Okay, and a reminder that we need to be value-adding in our overall judgments. Okay. So in the previous study design, this is how it used to be worded: quality and adequacy of water, air, and soil. And we just sort of then thought it was a bit of a mouthful. Also, what happened in the previous study design is we used to look at biodiversity as well as the amount of pest and introduced species. And we sort of said that, well, often when we're talking about biodiversity, we're talking about the good and the bad aspects of it. And part of that is the pest and introduced species. So what it looks like now is observable characteristics to assess the quality of water, air, and soil. But then we made sure that we made it clear that we wanted species and ecosystem biodiversity. All right, interesting past questions. You can see one from back in 2018 here. Using examples, describe the current level of biodiversity in this outdoor environment. So there you go, writing about biodiversity. For this one, it doesn't explicitly say species or ecosystem. So if you got a question like this on this year's exam, you could write about both, essentially, species and ecosystem biodiversity. But my tip is, or my guess is, that if this question like this was to be on this year's exam, that basically it would ask you specifically about one type of biodiversity. Right, another interesting question here. This is part of one of those Part B, that we would call them now, questions. Describe the current outdoor environment, referencing the levels of biodiversity and the quality and adequacy of soil, water, and the amount of pest and introduced species. So you can see there that that question wasn't letting students choose like a couple of observable characteristics. It was directing them to specific ones from the study design. All right, and this was off last year's exam. And this was assess one possible environmental impact on species or ecosystem biodiversity if this bike park was to proceed. And this was that question 6 with the stimulus material. I'm not sure if you remember that when we looked at 3.2.2, conservation, recreation, and economic relationships. And then in the end of that question, if you went back and and did, I think it was question 6 of last year's exam. Here you can see that, well, if we did something, like if we did install these bike paths, how could this impact on species or ecosystem biodiversity? So that's how this area was assessed last year. Okay, what have questions in the past asked you to do? You need to know all of those observable characteristics. You need to relate them back to your specific environment. There's also been a comment, and we're going to look at it in a moment, where assessors want to see you be really specific, particularly in this area of the course, and make observations that are unique to that environment. Mark allocation has ranged from 2 to 5 marks, and being asked to evaluate is a really common theme within this. Previously, the key skill was evaluate as well. So sometimes assess has been a question too, but we also now know that we might need to create possible solutions. All right. This is from the external assessment report. So what they are saying here, the chief assessor is saying, discussion around the health of an environment is often very generic. What that means, generic means very broad, very non-specific. When describing the health of environment, they say students need to make sure they are being specific to that environment and think about the questions they may ask in assessing the health. So what the chief assessor is saying here is that we don't want you to just we don't want you to refer to no environment. B, we just don't want you to refer to a large environment and say things like, oh, the water was clear, the soil was moist, the air, you could see a long way, it was visible, there was no smog. And whilst those are correct, you could really apply those statements to any environment in Victoria. So you want to refer to actual specific sites. So I'm just working my way down through this meme. You want to refer to specific sites, and then you want to use those examples from specific sites. And I'll show you an answer in a little bit as we move through this video that does that. So this is a little acronym I use with my students, SWOB. It's just, again, a nice, easy way to remember this, just in case you get a question about 2 observable characteristics with no supporting sort of information there. All right, I'm going to use Wilson's Promontory as the example here. My students, we don't look at Wilson's Promontory anymore, but it doesn't really matter. I used to with the school I was previously at. Basically, what we're saying here is that we should be able to use these observations when we go to any of these environments and make some assessments. So you could get some stimulus material potentially on your exam and be asked to make some assessments. So this is Little Waterloo Bay for anyone who's been there. And I could generally assess that this water is in a healthy state. I've been there, so I know you can see small fish swimming in the waters here, but we can see that the water's quite clear. We can see that it's healthy water levels, that it's supporting vegetation both in the water and outside the water as well. And we can see that that water is usable for human uses. You could just drink it if you wanted to. And I know some students that I've taught in the past that have. But what they're saying there is you should really boil or treat that water. Negatively, I know that people wash their dishes here. So a negative that we could talk about is that it's negatively affected through people washing dishes, and we may see detergents entering these waterways. All right, let's look at another thing. So this is Kerstop's Peak. It's probably the hardest part of this hike, where you hike all the way up to this view. And one of the things I could say is yes, there is good air quality here, but how can I say that? Oh, it's clear, I can see a long way. Yep, that's true. Other observations you could make though are, let's start with what I don't see. I don't see large roads, freeways. I don't see large factories. I don't see large energy production, no coal-fired power plants here. What I do see is lots of trees as well. So I know that whatever CO2 is in the atmosphere is being absorbed by those trees. So that's an example of some of the assessments I could make of the air quality. And then if we look at soil, generally speaking, the problem is going to be in a healthy state. Healthy soil doesn't need to be always dark in color and nutrient rich, because if we're talking about some of our environments are highly sort of specialized to having low nutrient soils, and some of those species need that. But if we're just talking about, if I'm having to assess the health of this environment, I could make some positive statements around the health of certain sites, such as Seals Cove, but I can also talk about some negatives. So again, any of you that have hiked through here, you would know that trying to get your tent in can be quite challenging at Sealers Cove because it's a really popular site. People hike in there, it gets used a lot, and that ground is really hard. And you really do need some sort of hammer or mallet to get those tent pegs in at this site because that soil is just so compacted. All right, we're going to look at question 15. So turn to that in your booklets, and we're going to look at this question first. It says evaluate the health of this environment by referring to two different characteristics. All right, well, let's look at how we do this. So here you can see the answer is going to move to looking at the Werribee Gorge, and we're going to be looking at Wathaurong country. So the Werribee Gorge and Werribee River being a specific site from within that outdoor environment. I just want to show you how I'm setting up my answer. So you can see the way I've approached this for 5 marks. I'm going to talk about the positives and negatives of the water quality. Then I'm going to go to the levels of species biodiversity, positives and negatives. And then I'm going to make an overall judgment about the health of this environment. And that's how I'm going to get my 5 marks. So I'm going 2 for water quality, 2 for levels of species biodiversity, and then 1 mark for my value-adding overall judgment call. Right, let's look at why else this is a good answer. Look at those specific site references. So yes, Wathaurong country, but we're referring to Werribee Gorge, and we're also referring to the Werribee River. Okay, let's have a look in here at where my answer. So I'm going to start with water quality. I'm going to say it's in a healthy state. Why? Because the water was clear and supported large biodiversity of vegetation. It was also suitable for swimming. However, a negative is that the water wasn't flowing very fast in certain parts as it was summer, and the water level was quite low, and we could detect an odour in some areas. So there you go, there's my evaluation, talking about the positives and negatives of the water quality at the Werribee River in the Werribee Gorge. Now we're going to move into the species biodiversity and say that it's positive because we saw many plant and animal species, and then it's backed up with specific examples. So when I took my students there earlier this year, we saw wedge-tailed eagles, we saw cockatoos, magpies, and other parrot species. However, negatively, we noticed some evidence of introduced species, particularly rabbits, and that's a negative of the species biodiversity. We saw that they cause some erosion in some areas because of their burrows and also through eating native grasses. So there's my 4 marks, and there you can see I'm using specific examples, specific sites, and it's a really clear structure. Now I need to do a value-adding overall judgment call, and I can't repeat myself. So what I'm going to say here is, well, the environment is in a relatively healthy state due to high levels of native flora, which we could see, and also here. And then you can see I've given an example there just to really give that value adding. So I've said high amounts of native flora and fauna, and I could also, that's referring to the species biodiversity, and then the example of what else I could hear. And that would be a good example of a value add overall judgment call. All right, there you go. We are ticking them off now. So in the next video, we're going to look at these threats and how they impact society and outdoor environments. All right, you're doing really well. Keep ticking off these videos as you keep working through them.